2. The Great Balloon Crime. Marty found it even worse than he had expected. He went round to the Millers for Paul's first visiphone call and was already restless from 3 days of mooching about, wondering what to do and whom to talk to. The screen circle showed Paul's head and shoulders and fuzzily the room behind. He realised he had had some fantastic notion that there would be a landscape, trees and stuff, but of course Paul was in the rehabilitation centre, under artificial gravity. The room was very little different from the rooms here. Conversation was strained and awkward. Halfway through, contact was lost in a burst of static which drowned sound and vision for half a minute or more. Mr. Miller was swearing under his breath. You got no extra time for loss of picture. When it cleared up, Paul said to him,
"I set up my chess set for the game that we're playing. I'll mail you the next move."
Mail came in with the supply rockets, photographically reduced onto transparencies which you read through a magnifier. The schedule was roughly 3 and 2 months. It was going to take a long time to finish the game. Marty said,
"Fine. You're going to lose that castle whatever you do."
The seconds ticked on. In a way, the 5 minutes of the call dragged, and in a way it seemed to be over almost as soon as it began. The circle flashed and died in the middle of a sentence from Paul. Mr. Miller said heavily, "That's that," and switched off. It would be a month before their next contact. It was not just a question of cost. The channels were needed for scientific and administrative communications, and private calls were strictly rationed. By the next call, or at least by the one after that, Marty thought Paul would be out of the rehabilitation centre, living a normal life. An Earth life. He said, "Thanks for letting me sit in, Mr. Miller. I hope I didn't hog things too much." Mrs. Miller said, "Can't you stay a little while, Marty?" "Afraid not. I've got a whole load of homework that needs doing." That was true, but he did not head back home right away. He felt restless and frustrated. He thought a workout in the gym might help and dialed a cab to the recreation centre. It was near the middle of the bubble, one of the tallest buildings, with 6 floors between the gym in the lower basement and the starlight room on the roof, which was the one place that people could go out to dine. You cooked your own food on the infra and prepared your own wine from instant, but at least the setting was different. A little different anyway. He found he had hit a bad time. The exercising machines were all full with people waiting, and the pool was crowded also. There was little more room on the bars, but he had found that he'd soured on the idea of exercise. It seemed better to go upstairs and take in part of the current movie at the ground floor cinema. He'd seen it already and not thought much of it, but he had an idea that he would feel less surrounded. He went up the stairs in float jumps, touching down on every 4th or 5th step. He stuck the film for 5 minutes before boredom drove him out. He ought, he knew, to take a cabin home and start demolishing that homework. Instead, he went up 2 more floors to the library and study rooms. At least it would be quiet and there might be a chance of being alone. There were 3 or 4 people in the library itself, and he went through to the rooms beyond. Of the 6 available, all but 1 showed the red light outside signifying "Occupied, don't disturb." He pushed open the door of the 6th and realised there was someone there too. Steve DeCross sat at the table and was busy writing. He looked up annoyed. Marty said, "Sorry, I guess you didn't put the light on." "Didn't I?" Steve was stocky for a Lunarian, a little shorter than Marty and more powerfully built. His face was broad but sharp-eyed. He had black curly hair and blue eyes, slightly protuberant behind contacts. "You want to use this place?" He closed his pad. "That's okay, I'm about finished." "No, it's all right. I wasn't doing anything really. Were you writing that book review for English? It's not due till Monday, is it? No, it's something of my own. He paused. I'm writing a book. Marty was surprised, but the surprise diminished with reflection. Steve always got low marks in English, but that was more due to his general awkwardness and lack of discipline than to being weak in the subject. He said some bright things at times. What about? Marty asked, and half expected to be blasted by a sarcastic retort. But Steve said, Oh, just slush. Pirates in the South Seas, that sort of stuff. It's crazy, but it passes the time. Can I read it? You can if you don't mind being bored to shreds. He stared at Marty. You heard from Paul yet? Well, I saw him tonight, when he visiphoned home. How is he? He seemed all right. Steve said enviously, He's lucky. In a way. A thought struck Marty. Being sent down, why can't you go? I mean, you don't have any folks in the bubble. Steve lived with foster parents who had a boy of their own, some years younger, with whom he seemed to have less in common even than with other boys. He said, I don't have folks down below either. Or none who want to go to the trouble of making a claim. I'm a ward of the colony, and the colony says I'm better off here. They ran the medical computer on me and it opted for staying. I don't get the chance to argue till I'm 18. That's tough if you want to go. Doesn't everyone? Oh, yes. He thought of his own decision, but could not bring himself to mention it. Though it's not too bad here, really. Could be worse, Steve agreed. Like a character in my book. He's been captured by the Spaniards and chained to the wall for 10 years in a dungeon on one of the islands of the Spanish Main. It's right by the sea, and every high tide he gets flooded to the knees. He gets bread and water, thin soup twice a week, and he has to fight the rats for it. They're 2 feet long, nose to tail, and keep their teeth sharp, gnawing through granite. He doesn't worry either. He's only got 10 years to go, and he doesn't have to pay taxes. Marty laughed. See what you mean? Well, if you're not busy right now. I'm not. I thought of going out to the wall, see if the mountains have moved any. Have a look for a moonbird. You want to come along? Marty said, I don't mind. Marty's mother said, I'm glad to see you found a new friend. Steve had been round to the apartment for the evening. He had brought some tapes to play of 17th century music. Marty knew very little about classical music, and he had been bored some of the time, but Steve was good at explaining things and telling you what to listen for. He'd enjoyed it more than he expected. He realised his mother's remark was not entirely wholehearted. She probably was glad he was not mooching aimlessly around so much, but he also knew that Steve made her uneasy, as he did most people. He was polite, but managed to give an impression to adults of being just about to bust out in some way. She would not suggest that he look for some other companion. She had said in the past what a pity it was that Steve led such a solitary life, but she was not happy about it. Marty said, Steve's okay. He's so bright. I don't always understand him, but I do my best to keep up. He's no cleverer than you, his mother said. He's very strong-minded, though. You don't want to let him influence you too much. They were in the tiny kitchen and she was getting the turkey ready for tomorrow's dinner. It was Thanksgiving Day. Since there was no such thing as vacations for people in the bubble, and school went on all year round, all sorts of minor holidays were celebrated. Chinese New Year, for instance, though there was only one person of Chinese origin in the colony, and he had been born in Africa and had never seen China. Tomorrow, anyway, it was battery turkey and no school. On Marty's urging, permission had been obtained for Steve to join them. His mother asked, "What time is he coming in the morning?" "I'm picking him up," Marty said. "We're taking a crawler out." Over the age of 12, you could take crawlers outside the bubble, if you wanted to. It was something else that was supposed to cut down the feeling of confinement. The crawlers had governors which cut the motors if you tried to take them outside an 8-mile radius from the main lot, and there was radio transmission back to the control point. So, no risk was involved. His mother said, "Don't be late for dinner. 1 o'clock prompt." "We'll be back, unless we find a moonbird." "A what?" Marty laughed. "One of Steve's crazy ideas. He's full of them. He has a lot of imagination." She trussed the turkey with a spike that had done such duty hundreds of times and will go on being used for years to come. Nothing in the bubble was thrown away while it had any useful life left in it. She said, "Some imagination's a good thing, too much isn't. Here especially." He knew what she was talking about. People were picked for mental stability, but occasionally it broke down. Only a month ago, a man had gone outside, tried, absurdly, to shatter the bubble with a crowbar, and then, with a dozen watching him from the other side of the barrier, had taken off his helmet and choked in vacuum. "Steve's all right," Marty said. She smiled. "I'm sure he is. Open up the fridge, darling, while I pop this in." It was dull. The sun's glare was harsher without the bubble's protective tinting, and there was dust and rock all round instead of the familiar paths and buildings. But there was really nothing to be seen that could not have been seen as well through one of the telescopes in the viewing room. The crawler lurched through a landscape that, apart from being arid and lifeless, was utterly without surprise. In the relatively near distance was the launch station. Further away, the smaller dome of one of the mines. The former lay within the crawler's active radius, the latter not. A special key was needed to unlock the controls that overrode the governor, and control section only issued them to people who were on duty. There were spacesuits in the crawler, but the same key was needed for opening the external door of the crawler's airlock. Steve drove the crawler under the escarpment until the motor died. He said, "See that draw just up ahead? Perhaps a quarter of a mile away the escarpment split, showing a channel wide enough to take the crawler that led obliquely upwards. You could see in for 50 yards or so before it twisted and disappeared." Marty nodded. "I see it. It leads up to the mountains." "I know." "You know what you might find up there?" "Moonbirds?" Steve said slowly. "Maybe a ship came down, maybe thousands of years ago when the Egyptians were building the pyramids. Maybe they looked in on them too. A scouting expedition from Regal or Betelgeuse. Only one of the ships crashed, here on the moon. Nothing could change, nothing can, so it's still there. Nose crumpled. Airlock bust open, so you could crawl through to see what's inside. All sorts of weird machines and instruments." Marty said, "You wouldn't see anything. No lights. Whatever kind of power they used, it wouldn't still be functioning after thousands of years." "Maybe they built the hull out of a transparent material. Like the bubble, only harder. Something like diamond. A diamond 1/2 mile long and hollow." "Diamond's carbon. It would burn to a cinder as soon as you hit an atmosphere." "Well, you could have a point," Steve said. "I could say that perhaps that's what did happen. Perhaps the rest of the fleet burned up in the Earth's atmosphere, but that would mean the Regilians, or Betelgeusians, were pretty stupid not to work it out in advance. and diamonds brittle as well as being hard. He shook his head. Not too probable, really. Marty said, maybe the power switched off when they hit, but works again when someone comes inside. You trip a lever or something. Or maybe the moonbirds have been nesting in it, and they lay their big luminous eggs. Steve pushed the control lever into reverse and the motor hummed into life. The crawler moved back and they could see the marks of its tracks in the moon dust, going so far and no further. I suppose we might as well head for home. We could go over to the launch station. No traffic for a week, Steve said. I'd as soon go back inside. Marty's father made up a bottle of white wine from instant and converted it to champagne type by adding sparkle. The boys had a glass each with their meal. Everyone ate a lot and afterwards they switched on TV. It was a revival of a remake of a musical spectacular. The adults watched it with mild somnolent interest. After a quarter of an hour, the boys excused themselves and went out. What now? Marty asked. I suppose we could go along to the centre and have a game of Zing. Zing was purely local. It had evolved out of table tennis in a response to the moon's lower gravity. It had a complicated set of rules, and in place of table and net, a flat surface with one end contained a sort of box and the other end open. You played from the open end into the box. Steve said, You beat me too easily. Games bored him, and he could not stay interested after the first few minutes. We might as well go there as anywhere, though. They cabined to the centre, squashing together into one rather than taking two. The games room were full of others who were, like them, free from school and seeking ways of passing time. The kindergarten was the only place where there was room to move. Since it was a holiday, the little ones were home with their mothers, who normally left them there while on duty. Marty and Steve fooled around with the equipment, built a castle of bricks and knocked it down. Then Steve said, Remember this? He was holding a warm air tube. It was used for heating certain low melting point plastics. The heat came from a fuel cell and did not get over 40 degrees centigrade, so it was quite safe even for very small children. They could use it to bend and reshape plastic rods and other objects. Marty said, Yes, but I was never mad on plastics modelling. Nor was I. It's just that I've had an idea. What? Come on up to the storeroom. I want to see if I can find something. The storeroom was closely packed and organised repository of items that has a seasonal use in the centre. Lanterns for the Chinese New Year, different sets of decorations, Christmas trees and streamers, all that sort of thing. It was among the Christmas stuff that Steve found what he was looking for. A carton of reusable balloons, carefully deflated and packed away for next year. Marty said, Well? Hot air rises. If we use the warm air tube to inflate them and let them go out of the window, they'll float up to the underside of the bubble. The idea was appealing, dozens of balloons bobbing upwards and fastening themselves against the curved invisible roof overhead. He said, And when the temperature equalises? They'll drop again, but they'll dodge about a bit in the convection currents. They should spread pretty well all over the bubble before they're down. There's something else too. What? The paints of downstairs in the kindergarten. We could paint faces on them before we send them up. You can draw pretty well. I can do Sharon, that bushy moustache and receding hairline and those old-type spectacles. The principal of the school would not wear contact lenses, claiming they irritated his eyes. He's pretty easy. Make them all Sharon, Steve said. 40 or 50 Sharons floating down all over. How's that for a nightmare? Marty laughed. What are we waiting for? Mr. Sharon removed the old-type spectacles from his nose and polished them with a cloth. He stared at the two boys who faced him across his desk. When he had given the forbidding silence time to sink in, he said, "Does either of you have any explanation or excuse?" Marty said, "No, sir." Steve echoed him a fraction later. Mr. Sharon said, "I would not have thought I needed to remind you of the importance of discipline in the colony, nor of the dangers of thoughtlessness. To take the materials question first, you wasted paint and also, unless a caricature of my features is to darken Christmas for years to come, wasted balloons. Neither of these is made here. Both have to be freighted across nearly 250,000 miles of space. This is not trivial because on the moon, no waste is trivial. This is something you have been taught over and over again, and which by your ages you ought to act on instinctively. Do you accept what I am saying?" They accepted. It was all Marty knew, absolutely right and sensible. Mr. Sharon went on. "Waste apart, there is the question of indiscipline. I am not so much referring to poking fun at your superiors as to the indulging of a childish whim. We do not have whims on the moon. We cannot afford them. Everyone's life in this colony depends on discipline and cooperation. And if it is to work in large things, it must be rigidly enforced in small." He pushed his spectacles back on. "Now," he said, "I'm not going to try to allocate responsibility between you. I have a suspicion, Marty, that you may have done rather more on the artistic side, but very likely Steve made up for his deficiency there in other ways. You were in this together, and you will be punished equally and together. We all suffer from boredom here, and it is probably harder on young minds than older ones. We do the best we can, and the center, of course, is the focal point for that. You two found yourselves so bored that you committed a stupid prank from which you must be punished. I could give you extra work here in school or extra duties, but I have decided on a different course. I think you must be made to realize your good fortune in having a place like the recreation center so that in future you will not treat its advantages so lightly. I'm therefore banning you both from using it for 1 month. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Sir." "Then you can go to your class, and after school you will occupy yourselves recovering the remainder of the balloons. It may be possible to paint over Marty's artwork and use them again, though that means using still more paint, of course." He paused. "I saw them going up. Very colourful they looked, but the moon is not the place for colourful things. Dismiss."